August 7th, 1942. 16,000 U.S. Marines are wading through chesty surf onto a place most of them can't even pronounce. Guadalcanal. It's a steaming chunk of jungle in the Solomon Islands, and these men have one job that sounds simple on paper. Capture an airfield the Japanese are building. They take it in about 36 hours with surprisingly light resistance. The Japanese retreat into the jungle. Mission accomplished, right? Wrong. That's when the real nightmare begins. The airfield they've captured isn't finished. It's barely more than a cleared stretch of dirt. And this isn't just any dirt. This is tropical soil that's been baking under equatorial sun one moment and getting hammered by monsoon rains the next. When it's dry, it's hard as concrete. When it rains, it transforms into something with the consistency of chocolate pudding. The Marines look at this strip and realize they're standing on a problem that could kill them all. They need aircraft, fighters to chase off enemy bombers, transports to bring reinforcements and medicine, light bombers to smash enemy counters before they form. Without a runway, none of that can happen. The brass on Guadalcanal begin to calculate in cold arithmetic. Every hour without air cover increases casualties, shrinks supply windows, and invites counterattack. Engineers arrive. Seabees with stained uniforms and a stubborn confidence that some problems are just a matter of muscle and invention. They walk the strip, boots slurping in the mud, and see what commanders see on maps, a location of strategic value and logistical impossibility. Concrete is fantasy. Heavy graders can't be shipped in time. The jungle won't wait. Then someone mentions an odd solution from training grounds back in the States. Pierced steel planking, panels that lock together and spread weight across soft ground. It sounds almost laughably simple, sheets of steel laid like a floor. But in that single absurd idea lies a way to turn a sucking, deathly field into a working airstrip, and to do it fast enough to change the battle on Guadalcanal. The race to make that metal road begins at once. The first thing the Seabees and Marine engineers do is start testing the soil, and it fails in every possible category. The ground can't compact, it can't drain, and it can't hold weight for more than a few minutes before liquefying. Trucks sink to their axles. Men walking in formation leave footprints that instantly fill with brown water. The Pacific wasn't just a battlefield. It was a machine that ate construction before it even began. And the Japanese knew it. Their partially built airstrip wasn't abandoned because they got scared. They abandoned it because they couldn't finish it in time. The tropical environment was beating them just as brutally as the Marines would. Now that same terrain was the Americans' problem. Engineering reports went up the chain of command immediately. Traditional runway construction would take weeks, maybe months. Weeks the Marines did not have. The Japanese Navy could strike at any time. The shadow of Rabaul, the largest Japanese stronghold in the Pacific, loomed just beyond the horizon. Whoever got planes in the sky first would own Guadalcanal. But the solution, as with so many innovations born in war, came from desperation and improvisation. Pierced steel planking, PSP, a material most Marines had never even seen before. It had been developed and refined stateside but had never been field tested on this scale. Not in jungle mud, not under actual combat conditions, and certainly not under a deadline where the wrong call could doom an entire division. Each panel was a sheet of corrugated steel, 10 feet long, with holes punched through it, not to reduce weight, though that helped, but to let soil and water push up through the panel instead of lifting it from below. Lock the panels together, and the weight of aircraft disperses across a network, not the swamp beneath it. It was simple, rugged engineering genius. But simple on paper didn't mean simple in the jungle. To lay PSP, they first had to clear, level, and reinforce the ground, all without the machinery normally used to do such work. Heavy earth movers weren't arriving anytime soon. The Navy was still fighting to hold the sea lanes. Every square foot had to be hacked, shoveled, pounded flat with sweat alone. Jungle roots became a bigger enemy than the Japanese snipers in the trees. Men worked shirtless, steam rising from their backs as if the ground itself were trying to boil them alive. And this wasn't just labor. It was labor under fire. At night, the Japanese shelled the construction site. During the day, snipers harassed anyone who stood too tall for too long. Water had to be carried by hand, tools broke. Heat exhaustion cycled with tropical downpours that turned progress into soup. The Marines had taken the airfield, but the engineers were the ones now fighting to hold it. Every hour the runway didn't exist was an hour without Allied air cover. Every hour without air cover was an hour the Japanese Navy could come roaring back. Every delay could collapse the entire Guadalcanal operation before it truly began. That's the moment the mission changed. It was no longer build a runway. It was build a lifeline, build survival, build victory. The Seabees began working in shifts around the clock. Sleep became a rumor. Mud up to their knees, rain hammering them sideways, steel panels stacked like precious treasure. This was the front line now, and unlike infantry fighting a human enemy, they were fighting something relentless and indifferent. Time. Because until the first P-400 or Wildcat could lift off that strip, Guadalcanal was nothing but a target waiting to be erased. The Mats weren't just construction material anymore. They were the first real foothold of American air power in the Pacific. And if they could make them work here, they could make them work anywhere. The 48-hour miracle hadn't begun yet, but its foundations were being forged right there in the mud. Before the first steel mat could be laid, the engineers had to solve a more primitive but far deadlier problem, the jungle itself. Guadalcanal wasn't just overgrown, it was hostile. Nature was the first enemy, and it fought like it wanted the island back. The Marines and Seabees began by clearing what looked like a half-finished runway, but they quickly discovered the Japanese hadn't stopped because they were interrupted. They had stopped because they hit a geological wall. Beneath the topsoil was a patchwork of dense, root-ridden earth and swamp pockets that acted like a springboard. The moment you put weight on one part, another bulged upward like a waterbed. You couldn't pave it, you couldn't tamp it down, and every shovel full of dirt smelled like rotting vegetation and stagnant swamp. They brought in hand tools first, picks, axes, shovels, sawtooth blades that dulled within hours. Sweat stung their eyes until the mud on their faces turned to paste. For every tree they felled, 2 more stood waiting like soldiers in formation. Even when the trunks fell, the root systems refused to surrender. It was like trying to dig an airfield out of a living thing that didn't want to die. Then came the burning. Huge piles of brush and cut vegetation were torched to clear space, but even that backfired. Literally. The smoke mixed with the wet, heavy air until visibility shrank to nothing. Mosquitoes arrived in hordes. So did fevers. Jungle rot spread through boots and skin. Nails cracked. Hands blistered. The Pacific wasn't a battlefield. It was a punishment. And all the while the Marines could feel the Japanese in the tree line watching. They might not have controlled the airstrip anymore, but the jungle was still theirs. Machine gun bursts from hidden positions forced crews to dive for cover. Mortar shells landed unpredictably, not to kill directly, but to stall construction. The Japanese already understood what the Americans were only now realizing. Whoever finished a runway here first would own the island. But the breaking point wasn't enemy fire. It was rain. A tropical downpour turned the half-cleared airstrip into a viscous soup in minutes. Tools sank into the muck. Footing disappeared. The slope of the field began shifting under their feet, like wet clay on a tilted board. Worse, the water didn't drain. It just sat there, heavy as lead, waiting to swallow the next wheel or boot that dared test it. That's when the engineers made a pivotal shift in strategy. Traditional grading? Impossible. Soil stabilization through compaction? Pointless. They needed something that acted like an artificial ground layer, something that ignored the mud beneath instead of trying to fix it. The solution wasn't to beat the jungle into submission. It was to outsmart it. The Seabees began hauling in coral and crushed rock from the nearby shoreline. By hand, they carted it in buckets, wheelbarrows, and improvised sleds. They layered it onto the airfield to create a basic foundation. Not strong enough to support aircraft yet, but good enough to keep the steel mats from immediately sinking. Then came the drainage trenches. Narrow, deep, and hand-cut through muck. Every foot they dug meant water had somewhere to go other than the runway. When the ground couldn't be hardened, it had to be relieved. It was brutal, repetitive, back-breaking engineering under fire. The kind of work nobody writes glory medals for. Only after this stage, only after they'd beaten nature just long enough for steel to have a chance, did the real miracle of construction begin. The mats were ready. The men were exhausted. Time was evaporating, and in the tree line, Japanese scouts were already radioing back a single terrifying observation. The Americans are actually building it. The first shipments of Marston Mats arrived just before dawn, stacked on the decks of a transport ship like giant stamped metal puzzle pieces. To a casual observer, they didn't look like much, just long, flat steel panels with evenly spaced holes punched through them. But to the engineers on Guadalcanal, they looked like salvation in rectangular form. Each mat was 10 feet long, 15 inches wide, and built from perforated steel so they could lock together like massive Lego bricks. The holes weren't decoration. They were drainage, grip, and weight reduction all in one. Soldiers called them Marston Mats, named for the airfield in North Carolina where they were first tested. But the nickname the Marines gave them out in the field was simpler and far more fitting: instant ground. But the mats weren't magic by themselves. They worked only if the surface beneath them could hold a minimum load without completely collapsing. and the enemy still hadn't stopped firing. Japanese artillery observers, hiding miles inland, had now realized what was happening. They weren't harassing construction anymore. They were targeting it. So the Seabees split into rotating crews. One building, one hauling, one digging, and one spotting incoming shelling. When the rumble of distant howitzers echoed through the jungle, someone would yell, "Scatter!" and dozens of men would vanish into foxholes before the shells hit. Then, 10 seconds later, they were back laying steel, as if nothing had happened. That was the tempo. Work, incoming fire, cover, back to work. The process of installing the mats was deceptively clever. First, the engineers laid a trial line, a thin backbone of connected panels straight down the center of the future runway. Once that spine was established, they widened outward in both directions like unrolling a steel carpet. Every mat interlocked with the next through hooked, tongue-and-groove-style joints. No cranes, no machinery, just manpower. But the real innovation wasn't the material. It was the speed. A traditional runway would have taken months. The mats allowed aviation engineers to skip 80% of the normal construction process. They didn't straighten ground, they spanned it. They didn't fix soil, they ignored it. They didn't tame the jungle, they laid steel over it and kept moving. There was another hidden benefit too. Aircraft wheels gripped the perforations like cleats. Mud might splash, but it couldn't swallow landing gear anymore. Still, there were problems. Lots of them. The mats were so hot under the tropical sun they burned bare hands. Men used canvas scraps as makeshift gloves until supply officers started issuing welding mitts. The panels also weighed 66 pounds each, individually manageable, but soul-crushing when carried repeatedly over 12-hour shifts. Then came the alignment checks. If the field wasn't perfectly straight, the first landing attempt could shear off a wheel assembly and turn a fighter into a flaming pinwheel. There was no room for error. Every connection had to be tight. Every panel had to lock flush. And they were racing the clock. The Japanese Navy still controlled much of the nighttime waters surrounding Guadalcanal. If reinforcement ships arrived before the runway was operational, the Marines would be sitting targets trapped on a jungle beachhead with no air cover. That's when a rumor began circulating among the ranks. A rumor that seemed impossible, and yet gave every exhausted man a second wind. A squadron of Marine fighters, real combat aircraft, was already en route. Not in a week. Not in a few days. Within 48 hours. And if this runway wasn't ready by the time they arrived, those planes would have nowhere to land. By sunrise the next morning, Guadalcanal sounded less like a battlefield and more like a steel factory thrown into a thunderstorm. Hammers rang, crowbars squealed against locking tabs, and the clank-clank-clank of panels sliding into place echoed across the clearing. No one was sleeping anymore. Not the engineers, not the infantry guarding them, not even the Japanese artillery. Spotters who could see the shape of an airstrip beginning to emerge through the smoke and dust. The mats weren't going down randomly. There was a rhythm to it, a choreography that looked chaotic from a distance but was surgical up close. One crew hauled fresh mats from staging piles. Another aligned them end to end like railroad track. A third slammed them into place with sledgehammers, while a fourth crew bolted sections tight before the next line expanded outward. All this, under sniper fire, in 95-degree heat, with no shade, no rest, and a tropical disease cloud thick enough to coat every breath with humidity. But the real danger wasn't fatigue, it was timing. The Japanese now understood exactly what the Americans were doing, building a runway that could allow U.S. planes to take off from the very island the Japanese had planned to use themselves. So they began night bombardments, long-range shelling, and probing jungle attacks meant to disrupt the build schedule. Several landing craft filled with mats were destroyed offshore before they could unload. The Marines adjusted the same way they had adjusted everything else since day one, by refusing to stop. When shelling started, crews learned to crouch without breaking formation. They didn't abandon tools or mats. They held them, waited for the blast wave, then slammed the panels again. Aerial recon after the war would later reveal something astonishing. The Japanese bombardment patterns assumed a normal construction timeline. They never imagined the Americans could finish a runway before heavier artillery could arrive. And the clock kept ticking. Behind the engineers, fuel drums, tool crates, and barrels of aviation lubricant were already piling up, as if someone had pre-written the future and was just waiting for the ground to match it. Then, late in the afternoon, the field hit a turning point. The first test vehicle rolled out. A tractor dragging a weighted sledge to simulate the mass of an airplane. If the mats flexed too much, popped loose, or sank, the entire project would grind to a halt. The crew stopped working and watched. The tractor crawled forward. The steel groaned, but held. The sledge bumped once, twice, then glided. The strip was holding. Men didn't cheer. They didn't have the breath for it. But their shoulders straightened, and the exhaustion that had been dragging their feet through the dirt vanished like fog burning off at sunrise. If they could taxi a tractor, they could taxi a plane. There was just one last obstacle: length. A fighter could land on a short field, but taking off loaded with ammunition required distance. The Seabees began extending the runway toward the tree line, laying panel after panel like a fuse burning toward a deadline that couldn't be pushed. No one talked about it out loud, but every man working that steel strip was thinking the same thing. Those planes are already in the air. There would be no second chance, no delay, no almost done. The runway had to be operational, not someday, not soon, but before sunrise on day 2. Because if those fighters arrived and found bare mud instead of steel, Guadalcanal wasn't just going to fall, it was going to vanish. The first 2 days of construction had been a frenzy of clearing, leveling and anchoring, but the final stretch, the last 12 hours, was where engineering met raw urgency. This was the phase where the jungle wasn't just beaten back, it was replaced. The moment the first Marston Mats began to lock into place, the transformation was unmistakable. A jungle clearing turning into a military airfield right before everyone's eyes. The engineers moved in tight formation, like a living machine. Nothing about the process was improvised. They had rehearsed this procedure dozens of times on training grounds. Now it mattered. The clock was ticking. Fighter squadrons were already circling nearby temporary bases, and air support further down the island chain depended on this field being operational. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Each mat, 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, was hauled by hand. There were no forklifts, no cranes, no support vehicles. The ground was too soft for anything heavier than a jeep. The men dragged and dropped the steel planks into position, staggering them so their strength multiplied as they interlocked. The holes in the mats let water drain instantly, a critical feature in a jungle where rain could pour down at any moment without warning. The rhythmic clack-clack of the locking tabs echoed across the clearing like a blacksmith's hammer. Soldiers aligned the panels, checked for soft pockets in the soil, tamped down edges, and kept moving forward. The runway stretched outward like a metallic spine, gaining length by the minute. To an untrained observer, it might have looked chaotic, but it was anything but. There was a choreography here. One crew laid mats. Another followed behind, hammering in the anchor stakes. A third double-checked seams for warping or slippage. Behind them, engineers sprinkled crushed coral or gravel between seams for reinforcement. By the time one section was finished, the next was already halfway done. These airfields weren't meant to last forever. They didn't need to. Their purpose was speed. Get the fighters or bombers in the air, establish forward momentum, deny Japanese control. That was the mission. And mobility was the secret weapon. The Japanese had to spend months building concrete bases. The Americans could do it in under 48 hours and move on. The jungle, once a natural barrier, had now become an asset. The thick foliage concealed the airfield from aerial reconnaissance almost until the last minute. Often by the time the enemy realized a new runway existed, American fighters were already taking off from it. As dawn approached, the rain finally came, not a drizzle but a full monsoon burst, the kind that turned foxholes into bathtubs. But this time it wasn't a setback. It was proof of success. Water sheeted across the matting and poured straight through the drainage holes into the earth below. The engineers watched the rain run off like it was sliding down armor plating. A dirt runway would be mud soup by now. A grass strip would be mush. But the Marston Mat pathway? Solid. Usable. Ready. Then came the moment that sealed the victory, the test landing. A P-40 Warhawk appeared overhead, circled once, dropped its gear, and descended onto the runway. Boots paused mid-step. Hammers froze in hands. The fighter touched down, hard. The way combat pilots trained to land on improvised strips. The mats didn't shift. The plane didn't bounce. The field held. A cheer didn't erupt. Soldiers were too tired and too disciplined for celebration. But the relief was visible. In war, certainty is rare, but this was certainty you could stand on. By sunrise, the first squadron was already lined up on the new strip, engines roaring, wings gleaming through the morning fog. Less than 2 days earlier, this spot had been untouched jungle. Now it was a launching pad for air power, projection, and a symbol of unstoppable momentum. The engineers didn't just build a runway, they built the future in 48 hours. When the first fighter squadron taxied onto the Marston Mats runway, the airfield was no longer just a feat of engineering. It had officially become a weapon. Until that moment, it had been a construction project. After takeoff, it became strategy, power projection, and mobility, all forged from steel sheets and the sweat of engineers who had worked without rest. The pilots lined up their aircraft one by one, engines rumbling like rolling thunder across the clearing. The smell of fresh-cut jungle still hung in the air, mixing with gasoline and hot oil. Everything about the place looked temporary. The patchwork tents, the improvised radio tower, the rough command posts scribbled into a canvas map, except the runway. The runway looked permanent, even though everyone knew it could be torn down and rebuilt somewhere else just as fast. The first pilot revved his engine. The mats vibrated but held. The men who built them stood to the side and watched with that quiet, unspoken pride that comes from creating something vital. They didn't salute. They didn't cheer. They waited. Airfields were more than landing strips. They were lifelines. Control the skies, control the island. Control the island, crack open supply routes. Crack open supply routes, break the blockade. In the Pacific, geography was everything, and geometry was the response. Every new runway was another angle of attack, another square foot of reach, another step deeper into hostile territory. Without these forward strips, aircraft would have been too far from the fight. But with them, suddenly the jungle became the front line. The fighter began rolling, engines screaming. The Marston Mats clattered under the force, a metallic chorus echoing through the clearing. The pilot accelerated, lifted off, and vanished above the canopy as if launched from a slingshot. That moment didn't just prove the runway worked. It proved that the entire Allied island-hopping strategy was viable. Almost immediately, reconnaissance planes followed. Then supply craft. Then patrol bombers. What had been a patch of wild jungle just 48 hours earlier was now a hive of aviation activity, and the Japanese didn't see it coming. From their perspective, these jungle islands were natural barriers. They assumed construction here would be slow, dangerous, and logistical suicide. Concrete runways took months to cure. Heavy machinery couldn't operate in swamp soil. Transporting material through dense jungle should have been impossible. But steel proved them wrong. Marston Mats were the great equalizer, bridging the gap between terrain and necessity. The enemy built immovable fortresses. The Americans built mobile launch pads. Within hours of the first landing, the airfield began doing exactly what it was built to do. Shift momentum. Fighters could now escort bombers farther. Patrol planes could scout new islands. Med-evac flights could pull wounded men to safety in hours instead of days. Transport craft could land with ammunition or fuel and take off with intel or evacuees. The difference wasn't subtle, it was seismic. The Japanese had to adapt quickly, because this wasn't just a runway, it was a declaration. We can build anywhere. We can attack from anywhere. And we won't wait. More importantly, it flipped psychological gravity. Before, the jungle was the enemy. Now the jungle was an accomplice, hiding the runway from enemy bombers, swallowing sound, masking movement. Steel and foliage formed a partnership that was almost poetic. Nature concealed what engineering created. By sundown, the airfield had already changed the strategic map of the region. That wasn't hyperbole. It was logistics made visible. Every plane that took off wasn't just flying a mission. It was proving a doctrine. In war, speed is a kind of ammunition. Speed builds surprise. Surprise builds momentum. And momentum, more than steel, fuel, or firepower, wins wars. This was the moment where invention turned into dominance. The jungle no longer belonged to nature. It belonged to whoever could build a runway first. Success didn't mean safety. If anything, it painted a target on the new airfield, and the Japanese wasted no time trying to erase it from the map. Just 48 hours after the first aircraft took off, the air raids began. They came in low and sudden, banking in from the sea or screaming down from the cloud line in blistering dives. Bombs cratered the jungle floor, shrapnel shredded palm trees, and engines burned like dying comets. But the runway held. Even when bombs missed by only yards, the Marston Mats absorbed the shock instead of splintering like concrete. Engineers patched dents with strips of steel and hammers, not bulldozers and curing crews. If a section buckled, they replaced it in minutes, not weeks. And that speed was everything. The Japanese expected chaos, long delays, scorched runway, grounded planes. Instead, they saw fighters launching again by the next morning as if the raid had never happened. The Mats turned what should have been devastating damage into a mild inconvenience. The Americans didn't just repair, they shrugged it off. But there was a larger truth looming behind every attack. This wasn't a fight over jungle territory anymore. It was a fight over time. The Japanese controlled islands by holding ground. The Americans controlled them by building faster than the enemy could destroy. Still, nature was unforgiving. Rains came in horizontal sheets. Mud tried to swallow supply trucks. The sea corroded anything metal left unattended. Mosquitoes and fever turned engineers into patients. It was like building a fortress inside a living, hostile organism, and the organism wanted every human intruder dead. And yet, morning after morning, the engineers were back out on the strip, tightening bolts, leveling panels, draining waterlogged edges, clearing debris before breakfast. They didn't have the luxury of rest. In war, aircraft don't rest, they refuel. The airfield had become a breathing entity, constantly in motion. Land, launch, repair, repeat. Every raid the Japanese launched carried a gamble. They weren't just dropping bombs. They were betting time. Every minute the airfield was disabled was a minute they regained the initiative. But the Americans countered with mobility. What took the Japanese hours of planning took the Seabees minutes to fix. Concrete cracks. Steel bends and bolts back into shape. The Japanese pilots could sense the shift. Before, American bases were predictable, thinly defended, slow to build, easy to track. Now, they were sprouting like ghost cities out of nowhere. One day jungle, 2 days later, thunder of propellers. The jungle became the strangest battlefield of the war, a place where infrastructure transformed faster than intelligence could adapt. Every new runway that appeared forced the Japanese to divert resources farther and farther from their core supply lines, bleeding fuel, aircraft, and pilots just to chase a moving threat. And here was the critical irony. The Japanese had initially started building the Guadalcanal airfield before they were driven off. They had the head start. They had the location. They even had the blueprint. But they never had the speed. Speed is invisible until it isn't. One day, the Japanese believed they controlled the skies. The next, American fighters were taking off from the very field the Japanese had intended to use themselves. The war didn't turn when guns fired. It turned when the runway became American. Even brutal air raids couldn't undo that shift. The jungle tried to break the airfield. The weather tried to drown it. The enemy tried to crater it. But steel stayed steel. And the moment the Japanese realized they couldn't stop these airfields from springing up anywhere, the psychological tide of the Pacific began to change. Because if you can build a runway in the middle of a steaming jungle faster than your enemy can destroy it, then the jungle is no longer a wilderness. It's a launch pad. The breakthrough didn't happen in a single battle. It wasn't marked by a heroic charge or a dramatic radio transmission. It happened slowly, then all at once, in hundreds of tiny decisions, repairs, launches, and takeoffs that built a momentum the Japanese could no longer match. By late August, the Marines and engineers on Guadalcanal were exhausted, sick, and often running on half rations. But the runway was alive. Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers roared down its steel spine every morning, launching sorties that chewed at Japanese supply convoys and forced their navy to burn fuel just to stay out of range. And here is where the unintended brilliance of Marston Mats became undeniable. The airfield itself became a weapon, not the planes, not the pilots, not the bombs, the runway. Before Guadalcanal, airfields were static assets, vulnerable, immovable, fragile. After Guadalcanal, they became battlefield multipliers. A functional runway meant reconnaissance. Reconnaissance meant ambushes. Ambushes meant ships sunk before they ever reached shore. The Japanese tried a new strategy, night attacks. If they couldn't bomb the field, they would starve it. Night after night, Japanese destroyers, the so-called Tokyo Express, thundered down the slot, landing troops, artillery, and ammunition under cover of darkness. But without air support, they couldn't hold ground once the sun rose. Every ton landed at midnight was bombed to scrap by noon. And all of that destruction was possible because Marston Mats bought time. Minutes here, hours there. Enough for American aircraft to stay operational. Steel had outplayed jungle, weather, and enemy schedule. Then came the moment that cemented what these engineers had really built. A tropical cyclone slammed into Guadalcanal like a swinging sledgehammer. Torrential rain turned the world to sludge. The airstrip should have dissolved back into swamp. Any normal runway would have vanished under a soup of mud and runoff. The Marston Mats didn't. They floated, not literally, but structurally. The perforations let the water bleed down into the soil instead of pooling on top. The steel stayed locked together. The subgrade softened, yes, but the matting spread out the weight so no aircraft bogged down. Storm passes. Engines restart. The airfield never closes. That was the moment the leadership knew. This wasn't just an engineering win. It was logistical revolution. By September, the Japanese high command was stunned. They couldn't understand why this little jungle airstrip refused to die. They assumed massive concrete reinforcement. They thought the US had shipped in heavy surfacers, graders, and advanced paving crews. They never realized the truth was brutally simple. One steel sheet at a time, section by section, bolt by bolt. 48 hours to build, and yet nearly impossible to permanently destroy. The Seabees, many of them civilian construction workers just months before had done something no doctrine had planned for. They made air power mobile. They dragged the sky down into the jungle and fastened it to the earth with perforated steel plates. Before Guadalcanal, territory was won by capturing land. After Guadalcanal, territory was won by creating land the moment you needed it. And the Japanese began to learn a bitter lesson. You can defeat men, you can overrun trenches, you can even take back a hill, but you cannot outrun an enemy that can build a runway anywhere they stand. The jungle was no longer neutral. It had turned coat, and now worked for the Americans. The war was beginning to tilt. Not because of a bomb, not because of a hero, but because a group of engineers looked at a swamp and said, "We can make that a runway by Friday." When the battle for Guadalcanal finally shifted decisively in America's favor, military historians pointed to aircraft, pilots, and tactics. But deep down, everyone on that island, from Marine riflemen to Navy admirals, knew the real turning point wasn't a dogfight or bombardment. It was when the runway stayed open. The Japanese lost because they could no longer deny the US a forward airbase. And they couldn't deny it because you cannot bomb steel mud-free. Every time a Dauntless or Wildcat lifted off from that matting, it wasn't just a mission, it was a declaration. You can shell us, storm us, or starve us, but you can't bury us again. What engineers built on Guadalcanal wasn't just infrastructure, it was precedent. A formula. A blueprint for the rest of the Pacific campaign. The Seabees began landing with the first wave, not the fifth. Airfields began appearing behind beaches before the enemy could launch their counterattack. Air power was no longer tied to geography. It became portable. By the end of the war, over 500,000 tons of Marston Mats had been laid across jungles, coral, marsh, volcanic ash, and even floating pontoon strips. They built runways where no runway should ever logically exist. And they built them fast. The Pacific didn't just belong to whoever won the skies. It belonged to whoever could create the sky, anywhere, in 48 hours. That was the quiet genius of the system. Victory not through destruction, but through construction. The US didn't just outfight Japan. They outran and outbuilt them, and that muddy stretch of Guadalcanal soil, once useless, unstable, and nearly fatal, became the steel spine of a new kind of warfare. A war won not just by bravery, but by engineering.